We usually say it at funerals. Even the most shell-shocked of mourners stir a little when the 23rd Psalm is read. There is something about its familiar cadences and soothing images that can penetrate our grief and bring a little comfort. In almost 15 years of ministry, I can't think of anybody underground who went down without it. The psalm is such a staple of our funeral liturgy. I think I've told you I'm careful how I use it with the sick. Say, "The Lord is my shepherd" at the wrong time, and a person can think he's dying. But this psalm brings comfort in other situations too. So soldiers at war say it. Patients facing surgery say it. Children afraid of the dark say it. And something within them relaxes into the green pastures, the still waters, and the strong but tender care of the shepherd. Harvard professor of Hebrew literature James Kugel asks, what is it about the pictures presented by this psalm that so speaks to the reader's hearts? Certainly the meaning of this psalm has changed over the centuries, so much so that even some of its images now need to be explained. The whole reality of shepherds and their flocks is nowadays remote from the experience of most readers. And the practice of anointing a person's head with oil sounds messy, not exquisite to us. The psalm cannot speak to our own lives as it did to those of past readers, but there is one aspect of this psalm that has always remained and has always made it almost unique. Here the psalmist does not, as so often elsewhere, approach God with a request. Help me, forgive my sins, crush my enemies, do not let me die. Nor, as also frequently, does the psalmist offer God thanksgiving after the fact. You did help me, and I'm grateful. Nor is it a psalm that celebrates God's grandeur and mighty deeds. This is just a psalm about ordinary, daily life, a psalm about you and me. You are my shepherd. You are my shepherd. It's a powerful metaphor for the reality behind God's name, Yahweh. I am who I am, it means, or I will be who I will be. God's very name was given to Moses as part of a promise. I am the one who is and will be present with you and for you, God said. How do we speak of that love and loyalty? The Lord is my shepherd, says the psalmist. And as someone noted in supper church on Thursday, the psalmist moves from speaking about the Lord as shepherd to speaking to the Lord, his shepherd. You are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The present personal nature of this psalm is unique and precious to many. When Christians read the psalm during the season of Easter, we have Jesus in mind as our shepherd. In the Gospel according to John, shepherd is one of many metaphors Jesus uses to describe who he is and how he provides for us. Elsewhere, Jesus calls himself a vine, the bread of life, living water, the light of the world. But in today's text, he is a shepherd, the good shepherd. Since shepherds were so common in the ancient world, the image of shepherd, that metaphor, appears time and again throughout Hebrew literature. The bad shepherds were rulers and leaders who trampled the poor in their quest for power and wealth, who fed themselves instead of the sheep, who failed to seek after the lost and the strayed, who ruled with force and harshness instead of kindness and mercy. The good shepherd was the one who would rescue them and gather them up, seek the lost, bring back those who had strayed, bind up the injured, and strengthen the weak. And then there's the shepherd of this psalm, the present personal shepherd, who gives sustenance and comfort and safety to each one of the flock, providing every need and pouring out grace beyond measure. This image of Jesus as Good Shepherd, who guides and provides and protects throughout all of life, is not hard to understand. And yet, as Columbia Seminary professor Kimberly Long suggests, it may be, in the end, a truth that happens to you, more than something you learn or figure out. To explain, Kim shares a story Anne Lamott told some years ago in her book, Traveling Mercies. It's a story about the way Jesus as shepherd happened to some members of Anne's church. One of the church's newer members, a man named Ken, was dying of AIDS, disintegrating before their very eyes. Shortly after Ken had started coming to the church, his partner, Brandon, had died of the same disease. A few weeks after the funeral, Ken had told them that right after Brandon died, Jesus had slid into the hole in his heart that Brandon's loss had left, and Jesus had been there ever since. Ken had a totally lopsided face, Anne says, ravaged and emaciated, but when he smiled, he was radiant. He said he would gladly pay any price for what he had gained, which was Jesus, which was the church. It is remarkable enough to imagine that a person so broken by death and pain could be anointed with such love that his suffering is overwhelmed by joy. But there's even more to the story. Here's how Anne tells it. She says, "There's a woman in the choir at my church named Renola. She is large and beautiful and jovial and black and devout as she can be. She's been a little standoffish toward Ken. She's always looked at him with confusion when she looks at him at all, or she looks at him sideways as if she wouldn't have to quite see him if she didn't look at him head on. She was raised in the South by Baptists who taught her that his way of life, that he, was an abomination. It's hard for her to break through this. I think," says Anne, "that she and a few other women at the church are, on the most visceral level, a little afraid of catching the disease. But Kenny has come to church almost every week for the last year and has won almost everyone over. He finally missed a couple of Sundays when he got too weak, and then a month ago he was back, weighing almost no pounds, his face even more lopsided, as if he'd had a stroke. Still, during the prayers of the people, he talked joyously of his life and his decline, of grace and redemption, of how safe and happy he feels these days. So, on this one particular Sunday, for the first hymn, the so-called morning hymn, we sang Jacob's Ladder, which goes, "Every rung goes higher, higher," while, ironically, Kenny couldn't even stand up. But he sang away, sitting down with his hymnal in his lap. And then when it came time for the second hymn, the fellowship hymn, we were to sing, "His Eye is on the Sparrow." The pianist was playing and the whole congregation had risen. Only Ken remained seated, holding his hymnal in his lap. And we began to sing, "Why should I feel discouraged? Why do the shadows fall?" And Renola watched Ken rather skeptically for a moment, and then her face began to melt and contort like his, and she went to his side and bent down to lift him up, lifted up this white rag doll, this scarecrow. She held him next to her, draped over and against her like a child while they sang. And then both Ken and Renola began to cry. Tears were pouring down their faces and their noses were running like rivers. But as she held him up, she suddenly lay her black, weeping face against his feverish white one, put her face right up against his, and let all those spooky fluids mingle with hers. It was, says Anne, a miracle. It is a miracle. How Jesus can fill a hole that is left from some unbearable loss. and how this good shepherd can cause one sheep to be so overcome with love for an unlikely other that she becomes like a shepherd herself, taking care, offering comfort, providing safety in her strong and loving arms. Part of the beauty of Anne Lamott's account of this story, I think, is the context in which Anne remembers and shares it. She's on an airplane that was delayed 3 hours, a plane 2 passengers had insisted getting off even after it had started taxiing toward the runway, a plane now airborne, but alarmingly bouncing and shaping and dipping like a roller coaster. She's in the middle seat of 3, next to a self-described, born-again Christian man who is reading a book Anne had coincidentally reviewed for a newspaper, a book he says is great, a book she had described as hardcore, right-wing, paranoid, anti-Semitic, homophobic, misogynistic propaganda. And on her other side is a woman with limited English skills, Latvian, maybe with some Korean heritage. The woman turns up her iPod and closes her eyes when the turbulence increases. They finally make it past the turbulence, and as the plane begins to level out, the pilot comes onto the PA system. He needs a doctor. Someone is having a heart attack. And through it all, Anne and her seatmates make an unlikely connection. They begin to see each other. When they hear that that sick passenger will be all right, they share a joke and collapse into laughter together. They lean into each other's airspace. Against all odds, these strangers begin to feel like family to Anne. To her, it was a small but significant miracle. I just invite you to hold such miracles in mind as you travel your own dark valleys, be they turbulent airplane rides or the I-95 corridor, city streets or school hallways, intensive care units, or homeless shelters. The Lord is your shepherd. I invite you to remember such miracles when you are face to face with your most cantankerous coworker, your most obnoxious classmate, that guy who steals all the glory, that neighbor who doesn't mow his grass, the foreigner whom you can't quite understand, the spouse or sibling who is making your life difficult. The Lord is his or her shepherd. Our good shepherd can happen to people, can happen to you in such a way that even though you are broken by death and pain, you feel full of peace and joy. Christ can come to us in such a way that he fills gaping holes in our hearts and astounds us with love, even for people we don't particularly like. So we become shepherds ourselves, providing care and comfort to others. May this most personal, most present, most precious psalm in the scriptures assure you of such good news, both here and here. May the truth of God's goodness so happen to you.